great pleasure in introducing first David Hoggarth, who is a Strategic Rail Director for Transport for the North. David, over to you.
Thank you. Morning. Well, thank you very much for coming along to this session on the wider rail network. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction. We've got some other speakers and then a Q&A session. The first thing I want to kick off with is a stat. 4% is the mode share of the rail network for journeys to work. 1.1% is the mode share for all journeys. Yet demand has increased by threefold over the last 20 years. So for me, that shows the potential of the rail network if it can be harnessed, because there's massive amount of growth potential there. We just need a network that delivers for people. So obviously, last week, as you heard earlier on, our board gave their backing to the high-level business case for Northern Powerhouse Rail. That's going to be the single biggest part of the strategic transport plan over the next 30 years. But this session is very much about the rest of the network that's supporting NPR. And really, it's absolutely fundamental. It's been mentioned already that the basics of the network need to work. If it doesn't work, as we've seen over the last 6 months or so, all the long-term plans, NPR, Strategic Transport Plan, doesn't mean anything to people who can't get to or from where they're going for work or leisure or whatever. And in last May, the system did break, and it broke big style. The industry lost the trust of the passengers. They broke the promise, which is the promise of the timetable, as things descended into chaos. The latest round of the National Passenger Survey showed the scale of the challenge that we've got to overcome. So if you look at on the Northern network, satisfaction dropped by 8% to 72%, and on the TPE network, Trans-Pennine Express dropped 13% to 73%. And commuters were even less happy with their journeys, which is no surprise given what they went through. So what went wrong? Well, as was said earlier on, there's lots of reviews underway, and we're not going to do those, or I'm not in this introductory session today. But essentially, there is a common theme, and it's about the lack of investment and the lack of integration and the lack of a system that's joined up. And we've had Richard George as an independent expert helping the industry to fix what went wrong last year. And I think some of the things he says are really, really pertinent, because he talks about an industry where individuals are absolutely committed to the railway, to helping passengers and making things work. And those individuals, many of them have worked very, very long hours to fix things since May and have given more than 100%. But that's not good enough, because the system isn't working. The system mitigates against sometimes doing the right thing for passengers. And really that's where our long-term vision for the network comes in, because we need to drive through some systemic changes here. And you heard Councillor Blake earlier on saying about giving the Northern leaders more control, more say, more powers and more funding. But the network needs integrating better, and there needs to be a guiding mind that can actually call a stop if things are going wrong, or equally push things ahead to the next level of development if that's what's needed. So our strategic transport plan is TfN's statement of what needs to be done over the next 30 years. If you look at NPR, that's going to deliver 1.3 million people within 60 minutes of 4 or more major centres. But the North and the rail network isn't just about the major centres, it's about that broader network. So if you're in Cumbria, you've had a really rough time over the last 6 months. If you're on the Lakes line, where up to Windermere in the start of the tourist seasons, there were no trains running at all. So it's about getting improvements in for those places. It's about looking at innovation and technology to get greener, cleaner trains in those areas, particularly where you've got national parks. So within our strategic transport plan, we've set out an outlined long-term rail strategy, which is about delivering high-quality integrated rail services. Our starting point was looking at the gaps. It's quite easy. We all know what the gaps are in the current network. We tried to quantify those as well. So we've looked at poor journey times, for example. If you look at the Durham coast, between Middlesbrough and Newcastle, two of the biggest urban centres in the northeast, about 430,000 people living just in those two places, never mind the places in between. It takes about 1 hour, 20 minutes to do the journey by train. Off-peak, it's 52 minutes by car, and that isn't good enough. 23 miles per hour average by train. So our long-term rail strategy says for that sort of journey, we should be aiming for 40 miles an hour average, and actually we should push beyond that as well. So we find that there's limited access to some of the airports and international gateways from some of the places. If you're travelling to Manchester Airport and you happen to be on a main line, you've got a reasonably good connectivity to the airport. But if you're trying to get to Leeds Bradford Airport at the moment, or you're in Cumbria and the connections to Manchester Airport are not that reliable, then it doesn't look quite so good at the moment. Capacity and capability of the network is just not there, particularly for things like freight services. We're going to hear from Maggie Simpson later on. But actually, if the capacity isn't there, you don't stand the chance of getting that growth, particularly in freight as well as passenger services. And we want trains that can contribute to better air quality and improve the climate change position. So we know the network needs to change. So in our long-term rail strategy, we set out 5 core themes around connectivity, capacity, customers, communities, and cost effectiveness. So if we look at connectivity, we're looking at gaps in the network. So for example, I was up in Newcastle and the northeast on Friday looking at the Ashington-Blythe-Tyne line. There's an area that is crying out for better linkages to the main centres where the job growth is. And these are areas that can support housing growth, but the connections by bus or car are really poor, the roads are congested. So can we make use of an existing railway line that's there and bring it back into passenger usage? It's not just about new lines though. If you look at services that just don't quite gel at the moment, you've got a service between Sheffield and Lincoln that calls at most stations. That's going to be improved by having an additional hourly service out to Gainsborough for the first time in May this year. So it's looking at opportunities for the network to improve and build on services that are already there. Capacity and crowding is a really big issue, not just for passengers, obviously, but also for freight not being able to have the access it needs. And one of the things our members tell us is they can't understand how the rail industry can't say what the impact of crowding is on passengers on a day-to-day basis. There isn't a figure or a metric that measures the impact on people being left behind at platforms when the train isn't long enough and they can't get on. And that's not good enough. We need a system that can provide that information, but more than just provide the information, respond to it and not have to wait 12 months to put an extra carriage on, or even longer because they don't exist if you're talking about diesel trains, for example, at the moment. We're looking at minimum standards. So it's not unreasonable, is it, to say if there's an existing railway, there should be a minimum of 2 trains per hour. But there's many routes across the north that don't have that at the moment. So our strategy sets out that as a minimum requirement. And we set minimum journey times and speeds for all routes as well. And we're suggesting that there should be a 50% improvement in the average speed of freight services by 2028. And I've travelled on the train from Port of Liverpool to Drax that takes 8 hours or more on a really convoluted route across the north. And I tell you, I was really sore and tired at the end of that journey, and it really makes the point that we can't provide decent paths and decent routes for freight to make it economic. And the difference is if you can do a trip, if you can do 3 round trips in a day compared to 2 or maybe 1 at the moment, that can turn a flow from being completely uneconomic to making it economic. And we need to provide the capacity on the network to do that. And it comes back to investment, and we've had piecemeal investment. There is investment going into services, trains, and to parts of the networks. We've got the 2.9 billion committed to the Transpennine route upgrade as things stand. But it tends to be stop-start, piecemeal investment. We need continual investment. And not only is it bad for freight and planning passenger services, it's bad for the supply industry as well. Rolling stock manufacturers can't plan ahead if they don't know when the orders are going to come. It's very much stop-start at the moment. We also want to make sure that the rail network is planned on a multimodal basis. Rail is not something done in isolation. For too long, the industry has planned on its own basis, on an operational basis. We need to get back for planning for passengers and freight customers and get joined up across other modes. So smart ticketing is a huge step forward. As was mentioned earlier on, we now have smart cards being rolled out across the north of England. There'll be flexible season tickets coming in later on in the year. But actually, what we need is to get cleverer about using information better. And one of the elements of the SMART project is to improve the provision of information. I think the rail industry often keeps its information secret on special websites and hard to access. And you have to know to go on specialist enthusiast websites to piece together bits of information about your journey. It shouldn't be like that. It should be there, available for commuters and passengers, pushed out to their mobile phones if that's the way they want to get that information. So what we're going to do next, we've set out the long-term rail strategy, we set out our plan, it's there in the strategic transport plan. We're going to take that and convert it into a series of delivery plans, which will be setting out how we will improve things on fares. It will set out the investment needed on the network to improve capacity, for example, and remove the barriers to making rail function better within communities. All too often, rail is something that's special and got a sort of barrier around it, so you can do a town centre scheme and then suddenly stop at the railway boundary because it's just too hard to do business with elements of the rail industry, and that needs to change. Some really good examples of where that is changing. I went up to Redcar last year in the northeast and saw how they'd managed to bring the streetscape into the station environment in a seamless way, so it doesn't look as if it's a completely different place. You just move seamlessly from street into the station. We need to see more of that, and we need to challenge the ways of doing things and get costs down. So, despite all the problems of the last year, I think through the strategic transport plan and the long-term rail strategy, we can be optimistic that rail is there as a mode that people want to use, whether it's freight customers or passengers. We've got improvements coming on stream, 500 new carriages coming on stream this year across the north. The retirement in the end of the Pacers, which I had to endure coming over to Sheffield this morning from Leeds. So with the backing of the strategic transport plan, with the backdrop of Northern Powerhouse Rail, we can really start to make a difference and overturn that period of underinvestment. So the vision, I think, from Transport for the North is really clear. We need a system where passengers and freight customers are back at the heart of it and back at the heart of decision making. We need a system they can rely on, and we need a network which customers find easy to use and easy to access, and above all, a railway which supports the economy and the communities it serves. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Now I'd like to introduce Andy McDonald, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Transport.
Thanks very much, Pete. Thank you. Morning, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to speak to you. It's good to be back in Sheffield again. This great steel city is one of the mighty pillars of the north of England, and a visit here is always a useful vantage point on which to reflect on transport issues. But before I do that, I do want to pay tribute to the leadership of Transport for the North and the work that you've done, especially over the last year, in making the case for transport improvements. And every part of Labour, from the national to the regional to the local, shares your vision for an integrated, affordable and reliable transport system of which the North of England can be truly proud. And it's an imperative that the decade from 2020 is one which sees a transformation in the entire transport system across the north of England and its rail services in particular. And I sincerely hope we have a Labour government in Westminster with the commitment and the determination to deliver this. I think we're all extremely pleased that last week we heard of the industrial action on Arriva North had been suspended, and it's a small step forward. But it's absolutely fundamental that a railway can only ever be successful if employers and employees maintain dialogue and engage in consultation over the process of change. And I hope that Arriva North and the RMT can follow in the footsteps of Greater Anglia and the Union in that instance, and many others, and come to an agreement on driver-only operation which critically addresses the issues of safety and accessibility. I'm hugely impressed by the vision for transport across the regions of the UK, and your Northern Powerhouse Rail Strategic Transport Plan is a huge contribution to the debate. And I know in Leeds, the ambition is to use the redevelopment of the station as a catalyst for the transformation of the city centre. Greater Manchester's recently published draft transport delivery plan has widescreen aspirations. And a bit further south, the West Midlands Rail Executive has approved a new 30-year rail strategy. And of course, here in Sheffield, there's a very proud history of innovative thinking in public transport terms, and I've no doubt that will continue apace. The strategic outline business case you will soon submit to government is a powerful evidence base on which to build the Northern Rail infrastructure for the decades ahead. And the Labour Party applauds your ambition. We want to see the Northern Railway network on an equal footing with the South, and Labour will prioritise Northern connectivity in our approach to improvements and enhancements. Our National Transformation Fund will provide a significant boost to both rail and wider infrastructure across the north. These grand plans and sense of purpose from the regions on transport, I'm afraid, stand in stark contrast with what we're seeing at the moment from Westminster. Perhaps that's a little unfair, but I do have to go and leave this place to go and hold this government to account over its latest debacle over the cancellation of a ferry contract with no ferries. But there we are. That's the sort of backdrop that we have. But the ongoing gulf between transport spending in the north and south is a scandalous case in point. And only last week, the analysis of the government's national infrastructure and construction pipeline revealed that the Conservatives are failing to invest in the transport needs of the north. And my heart sank at reports which suggest that Pacers will remain on the network next year. And I've asked Chris Grayling to confirm this last week, and like many things, I await his response. And of course, last night's timetabling chaos was an absolute disgrace for the people of the north of England. It highlighted the lack of accountability and leadership across rail. I know that TfN believes that the railway should be right at the heart of development and regeneration to build cities which are good to live in and good to work in. The future lies in attractive, livable cities with rail and all public transport modes being fully integrated with each other, making cities that are good for people travelling to and from, be that by public transport or by foot or by bicycle. And to achieve that vision, the railway must be tightly integrated with those other forms of public transport. This in turn requires a railway which is much more responsive to the aspirations of devolved transport authorities to develop and improve cities and the city regions surrounding them. And the current structure doesn't deliver this. Labour's national structure will more closely align with devolved transport authority areas. Devolved authorities will be integral parts of the decision-making structures in the publicly owned railway. Our plans will also ensure that devolved transport authorities have a major say in the flow of finances into the railway in their areas. And of course, re-regulation of buses will be a key priority for the next Labour government. Our buses are in crisis with falling patronage, soaring fares and budget cuts by nearly a half since 2010. A key solution to improving local services is by giving local authorities greater powers and more funding for congestion-busting infrastructure, such as traffic lights that give buses priority. But rail's had a torrid 12 months. The government and the rail industry's unambitious plans for ticketing cannot restore faith in the system. The current adversarial and uncooperative rail structure can't possibly deliver the fare reform we need. And under our plans for public ownership of rail, there will be an opportunity to sort out the mess of rail fares and ticketing, and that will give a chance for transformation at both the regional and local level. Our aspiration is for a comprehensive system of contactless payments using smart cards and mobile phones across the network. And there's a commercial logic to this. Complexity is bad for business, and simplicity that drives growth. And I came here today from Middlesbrough, via York, via Doncaster to get to Sheffield. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bits of kit to get me across this journey. And it just becomes a confrontation and a source of discomfort for the entire journey. That's ludicrous, and we must change it. So I very much like the slogan adopted and in fact achieved by Munich City Region Transport Association: one network, one timetable, one ticket. That's what we should aspire to, and Labour's plans for rail and other modes of public transport will put us on course to achieve just that. High-speed rail is vital for the whole country, not just in terms of connectivity, but also new housing and jobs. In particular, it's crucial for all modes of transport, as well as being important to the rail network. It will improve surface access to airports, unlock capacity for rail freight to and from ports, and free up space on our congested roads. Like MPR, it will deliver an economic transformation with tens of thousands of apprenticeships and jobs across the construction industry and the wider rail supply chain. The naysaying voices have raised their heads in recent months, and only last month it was suggested that white elephant projects should be slayed to unleash the economy. In my view, that sort of talk's dangerous. Britain's transport system desperately needs new capacity, and HS2 is critical to delivering this. Of course, HS2 itself needs to be accountable and transparent, but it's essential that the phases of HS2 align with the much-needed upgrades to the railways in the Midlands and to the development of NPR. Phase 2 has particularly strong economic benefits, so greater clarity and certainty on Phase 2B is urgently needed. And in terms of investment in high-speed rail versus the existing network, I say it's not a question of either or. It's both. And having said that, there will be no blank cheque from Labour. But we want more freight on rail and support maximum modal shift from road to rail where feasible. Rail freight is key to the UK's industrial strategy and regional economic regeneration. The lack of additional rail freight capacity is a huge omission from the Transpennine route upgrade, both for the railway as a whole and east and west coast ports. But the dangers of resetting the commitment as to the current plans have been made very plain to me, and I accept that point entirely. But I do believe that this is a missed opportunity because we may see an increase in the use of container and ferry services direct to the north from Northern Europe, depending on the landscape from April onwards. And the onward rail and road connections are currently the Achilles heel in our regions for convincing cargo owners or shippers to switch. Haulier capacity and rail paths are available, but the cross-country routes are insufficient, and the need is for sustained investment. The government's failure to fully leverage the Transpennine upgrade is all the more frustrating. In the face of substantial investment in ports and airports across the region, northern ports are investing. Peel at Liverpool, ABP on the Humber, Tyne North and South Bank, and in my area, PD Ports at T-Sport also have ambitious plans to grow. Regional airports like Manchester and Leeds Bradford have major investment plans, so public investment must keep pace with private investment. What's more, I support the UK ports, major ports group's call for an integrated freight strategy for the UK. I think it's particularly important for the North to develop key freight corridors across the transport modes to improve trade links. We need to move away from the siloed approach to planning by mode of transport. TfN has an obvious opportunity to lead on this. Now, the major UN climate change report a few months ago sadly highlighted the lack of ambition in the UK's plans to improve air quality and reduce carbon across transport. The recent rail decarbonisation task force report was a reminder that electrification is the best way to decarbonise and modernise the railway. And we should have that rolling programme that is commensurate with it. But I can't come here today and not mention the B word, much as I'd love to, but I need to say a couple of things and repeat that Labour respects the referendum result, but no one can respect the government's handling of the Brexit negotiations over the past 2 years. And last week, Jeremy Corbyn set out Labour's Brexit proposals in a letter to the Prime Minister. And this is a credible and serious proposition that can provide the basis for a close economic relationship with the EU. Labour's demands focus on seeking significant changes to the political declaration. And at this late stage in negotiations, any withdrawal agreement will need to guarantee no return to a hard border on the island of Ireland. These demands would need to be underpinned by primary legislation to help ensure that future governments could not break them without the consent of Parliament. And any negotiation with the EU will clearly require flexibility and compromise. And I believe Jeremy's letter sets out a credible basis for that negotiation and a potential blueprint to deliver a close economic relationship with the EU. But to conclude and revert to what I perceive is the critical issue for us here this morning, rail. Rail urgently needs reform. Labour wants a railway with rising patronage. We want a railway with rising investment, and we want a railway that cost-effectively uses the public money which supports it. Transport for the North has a key role in delivering this, and I look forward to working with you to achieve this in the months and years ahead. And please accept my apologies if it is that I have to now run to London for my urgent question with the Secretary of State. But many thanks for inviting me here today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you. Well, our next speaker is Councillor Rachel Bailey, who I know very well indeed, as she is the leader of Cheshire East County Council, and of course is the best station on the network. In fact, the most important station on the network, which is Crewe. Because you can't get to the north without coming through Crewe, unless you come up the east coast, and I wouldn't travel up the east coast. Nah. They only built that to get coal from Newcastle. So, Rachel, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Pete. Good grief, we better put some context to Pete saying he knows me very well. It goes back to Warrington in the 1980s when I was working in the New Golden Square, and there was Pete Waterman absolutely creating the voice we now know as Rick Astley. And yes, I still jog round the room or the kitchen, but sadly Pete's not usually there at the stove with me to do that. Now, I've come here today to absolutely celebrate the work, the agreement of members and the launch of the Transport for the North's Strategic Transport Plan. It's said very quickly, you can only imagine the hours that have gone into that. Not only the evidence base of what is required, but the evidence base that was set several years ago now with the Sir David Higgins report into high-speed rail and the reference, though that absolute key reference to the rebalancing of the northern and southern economies. We must never lose that in the frenzy of political games and speech, which puts us at risk, as Councillor Judith Blake said earlier. We are on the cusp of an opportunity where, politics aside, we need to work closely together within the Northwest to deliver the rightful structure and not argue over whose fault it was previously. I'm also going to talk today, or focus today, very much on the intrinsic link of high-speed rail and Northern Powerhouse Rail. That very much is a Cheshire and Warrington vision. But I'm going to start with the Cheshire East vision, which is that hub station in Crewe, which I became closely involved with on a political basis when I became leader of Cheshire East Council in early 2016 now. But being a local person, I'm well familiar with Crewe Station, and I'm well familiar with the lack of investment for such an important location that history dictates between London and Scotland. And it's to Pete's credit that Crewe is now on the map. I have simply become his echo. No, I've overtaken his voice. So Crewe is a major rail gateway for Cheshire and the North, as well as an interchange for 6 different rail routes and a major centre for freight. Cheshire and Warrington is the strongest performing economy measured in terms of GVA in the north of England, and one of the strongest performing nationally. Cheshire and Warrington generates around 20 billion GVA annually and has 430,000 people in work, which is similar to Leeds and Birmingham. But a heck of a lot of those people commute in every day, and a heck of a lot of those people use Crewe Station for their ongoing journey. So I could be quite insular actually. I could say, yes, as long as we get the hub station at Crewe, that's fine. But I'm not saying that. I am absolutely saying that the added value and the opportunity for the North West and the SDP is key. And I'm also saying that the work locally within authority areas and within TfN to continually rebuild and refresh those business cases, I believe will ultimately quell the scaremongers about this opportunity for investment within our area. So the Crewe hub station could be served by 5 HS2 trains per hour. How many times have you heard it said? 5 to 7. The additional 2 are key with regard to Northern Powerhouse Rail, in that a northern spur, a northern junction, brings that additional connectivity to Liverpool and also to Preston. So Cheshire East has developed a comprehensive HS2 framework and master plan vision for Crewe, which demonstrates its vision for the town to capitalise on the opportunity. Remember what we heard in the opening comments. This isn't just about infrastructure. This is about improving people's lives. This is about ensuring that in the North West, we don't only attract the necessary skill set, we retain it. It is an anathema in Cheshire and Warrington. We have some of the best schools. We have some of the best performing youngsters. But just like my daughter, they go to the city for university and they don't return. I see this as another opportunity to ensure there is a balancing within workforce and in workforce journeys. We're acutely clear at TfN of the importance on focusing on impact of the environment. So if we look at high-speed rail and the headlines with regard to the impact on the environment, it's like a history lesson. All over again, when rail hit our shores, it was absolutely going to tear up our beautiful countryside. Well, I say to you that actually the current system is tearing up our countryside with the number of highway journeys, the amount of freight that is required to travel by road rather than on rail. And that is a key message, not just to leaders of authorities, not just to TfN, but also to our people, to our commuters, to our investors, that with the plan that we have before us, it's that multimodal opportunity to join up journeys, be they road, rail, or bus, just like they do in Europe. And we actually drew the plan up for those many of those countries after the war. And here we are struggling. So why are we struggling? We're struggling because we're a great democracy. We ensure that we consult. We ensure that we involve the people in decision making. We don't say, just do it. And involving those people, we absolutely need to get those key messages out to take away the fear of this fantastic opportunity. Pete's giving me the look. I will shorten my words very, very quickly. I welcome the endorsement of high-speed rail by Transport for the North, and I welcome the endorsement of Northern Power Rail and the join-up and the importance that it will bring to our economies. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rachel. I thought she was going to say we used to see each other down Mr. Smith's. Right, now, our last guest this morning is Maggie Simpson, who's the Director of General Freight. Now, this is quite interesting because we've talked about people running railways, we've talked about infrastructure, and even Rachel was talking about infrastructure. We're going to hear now a perspective from somebody who uses the rail network for freight.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Of course, we all know that the North of England invented the railways. But whilst the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was busy running passenger trains and running over MPs, 5 years earlier, the Stockton and Darlington Railway had been built for the movement of freight, coal in fact, ultimately ending up in Andy McDonald's constituency for being shipped out through the ports. And if you take a trip over the Pennines, you can walk down the remnants of the Peak Forest Tramway, one of many railed tramways that brought stone down from the quarries into one of the first multimodal freight hubs, Canal Basin, where it was made into lime, put onto barges and shipped on. So the railways of the north of England have always been about the movement of freight, and they remain so today. Rail freight drove the Industrial Revolution, moving coal and iron ore and steel, building buildings like this magnificent hall that we find ourselves in today. And today the north is an absolutely key region for rail freight. We're moving stone, cement, sand to and from the region for industrial processes and for building homes and infrastructure across the UK. We're moving petrochemicals and other bulks to and from the ports and into industry. We're moving letters, supermarket goods, and we're supporting importers and exporters across this region, both in terms of goods in containers, but also in cars and other products that are moving in and out to global markets. Work from the Rail Delivery Group estimated that rail freight is delivering something in the order of £750 million in benefits to this region every single year, in environmental gain and in productivity benefits to those who use the network for rail. And that makes the north of England the single biggest beneficiary of the rail freight network, more so than any other market. And even though we live in congested and constrained times, Network Rail estimate, even allowing for those difficulties, that we may see 2 to 3% growth per annum in the next 5-year period and more beyond. So like the passenger railway, freight railway in the north of England, you might say, has been a little bit neglected. We don't have pacers, thank goodness, but nonetheless there are issues on the network in the north of England that restrict our ability to do more and to deliver greater economic benefits. The South Transpennine route, so vital for our construction markets, is congested. We struggle to get more paths for new services into the cities. On the west coast and the east coast, finding new paths is increasingly difficult, getting out from the destinations, ports and businesses in the region out to other markets. High Speed 2 is a fabulous investment, but it raises some real challenges when those trains drop onto the existing network at Crewe and elsewhere. Some of the plans show fewer paths for freight after High Speed 2 trains start running than there are today. It's simply unacceptable for us. Compared to the Midlands, this region is underrepresented in rail link warehousing. If you look at the plans in the planning system today for rail link warehousing, they're in the East Midlands, they're in the West Midlands, they're in Northamptonshire. There are none in the north of England at the moment. There are some exceptions to that, iPort at Doncaster, which opened last year, and the existing facilities, of course, which do a great job. But we're underrepresented compared to other areas. And as others have reflected, if you want to take a container on rail from Teesport to Manchester or from Liverpool into Leeds, you have 2 routes today. You can go via Birmingham or you can go via Scotland. So we're grateful to the people of Scotland and the West Midlands for their investment in the rail network to allow that to happen. It's rather woeful that we don't have that same investment here today to allow the direct and cost-effective route to be open. So everyone in the rail freight industry strongly welcomes the Strategic Transport Plan, which sets out a blueprint for investment in the railways in the north of England. And what's more, we thank Transport for the North for their dialogue, interest and investment in freight and logistics. Their freight and logistics work is groundbreaking, I think, in the way that it's valued the benefit of freight movements to the economy. And I think there is work in there that we could leverage very well across the rest of the country in terms of the methodologies that have been used. We've had excellent engagement from Transport for the North at all levels, and the document correctly identifies the very significant challenges that we have today. But as David noted, it's just a plan, and what we need now is delivery. And what we would like to see is those delivery plans that David and the team I know are working on now really put freight at the front. Because if you are a business looking at whether you use road or rail, you need to know that there is a delivered plan, not just an aspiration. And that is the challenge for the next few years, converting the plans into reality. So what do I think needs to happen as our next step? What would my delivery plan be, perhaps? First of all, we need to get the freight capacity put back into the North Transpennine upgrade. Personally, I think it's criminal that we're about to spend almost £3 billion, but that will not deliver a single additional freight path over that vital axis. This has to be remedied. And we need a pound sign on it, and we need a date, not just a vague aspiration that we'll come back to it at some kind of future date. High Speed 2 is a fantastic opportunity for everybody. What I would like to see is that we take some honest assessment of the issues it creates on the existing network, and we come up with a plan now to remedy them before those trains start running. Because if we don't, we will not get the success from High Speed 2 that it commands and deserves. And these are fixable, absolutely, but we need to talk about them and we need to fix them. An NPR, a fabulous scheme, is going to be absolutely transformational, and we know that there will be real benefits from that in release capacity on the existing network. So let's work out now what of that release capacity can benefit the freight sector, where that capacity will come, and make sure that that's banked in the planning of NPR, that it's not just left as an aspiration, but that it's on the network and that it's protected as such in that planning system. If we do those things, then, as Andy McDonald outlined, the private sector will do the rest. It will build the terminals, it will build the rail link warehousing, it will build the wagons, it will upgrade the ports. We are doing that today. It's a classic public-private partnership, and we want to get on and deliver more for this region, and I hope that the plans that the STP and NPR now begin to formulate will really deliver for us and for the businesses that rely on using rail freight across the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. If you'd like to take a seat. Now, just to get some historical facts right, because I know as a train spotter, I can't let you get away with the Liverpool-Manchester Railway was built for passengers. Of course, it wasn't. It was built to beat the prices of the Duke of Bridgewater's canal and the pilferage that went on it. So let's get historically, let's get it right. So just a point of order there. Now we're going to have some questions, and I want the questions from the floor. Oh, look at that, straight away. Could you tell us who your question's to, and everybody will answer it. Thank you.
Anybody who wants to answer it.
Go on, give us your name.
My name's Julian Newton, and I set up a company, a not-for-profit company at the moment, called Northern Railways. And I'd like to ask the panel, why is Woodhead Railway line always the elephant in the room?
I'll have to take that one.
I'm not convinced with the work that's been done since Sir David Higgins, first of all, penned the document with regard to rebalancing north and south, but then penned the case for HS2, and I'm going to say it, aren't I? A hub station and its connectivity for crew. I'm not convinced that railways are the elephant in the room. I think what the difficulty is making it work to get the best absolute business case for both passengers and freight, in other words, capacity, and dealing with and working with a Victorian network. That's the overarching challenge. And then it's the investment of and the bringing together of so many partners And to me, those have been some of the hurdles that have needed to be overcome and still will be. But the progress made is phenomenal.
David, I think more of a specific point was why you're not opening the Woodhead tunnels up, correct?
The Woodhead railway line is...
Well, it's the tunnels, basically.
Well, yeah, it is the tunnels, but it's the railway alignment. It's a east-west direct link between Liverpool. If you draw a line between Liverpool and the eastern ports, it goes straight through Woodhead. Okay,
Right.
That would be the tunnel.
Should I take that one?
And,
Yes.
And it could be opened up to in this year. It could be opened up this
Well,
year.
it couldn't. That's a fantasy. It would take 10 years, and it costs a hell of a lot of money. So let's not kid ourselves. I'd like to go through the Woodhead Tunnel myself, particularly on one of the the 26s. But it isn't that easy. You know a bit about this.
Well,
Come on.
I mean, look, we want to get goods from the East Coast ports into the conurbations and there vice versa. And there are lots of potential routes that one can look at for doing that. Mm-hmm. The trouble that we have is that there is always wouldn't it be great if we just didn't do freight in this upgrade and then it could go via this route mentality? And this isn't unique to the north of England, it's everywhere. If only freight went via the Settle and Carlisle, brackets, the bridges are weak, close brackets, we don't have to upgrade the West Coast. If only freight went up the joint line, brackets, we're not going to build a flyer over at Warrington for a while, then we can free up the East Coast. If only freight could go a different way, we'd have more trains in London. And the Woodhead and Skipton Colne are perfectly viable route options. But what we need is passing the upgrade, which is funded today. Because it's funded, and it's got a deadline.
But Woodhead could be funded.
Yes, but it isn't.
Woodhead could be funded by the private sector. Easily.
Oh, well, we'll come back to that one. That's another elephant in the room. I'm going to take one there, please. The gentleman behind. We'll come back to that, because I'm very happy to talk about public funding. Please.
Morning. Peter Kennan, Transport Lead at Sheffield City Region Local Enterprise Partnership. I was really happy to be there, Pete, with you last Thursday, seeing the adoption of the Strategic Transport Plan and the Statement of Business Case for Northern Powerhouse Rail. It was a great day. Driving back, I was just reflecting on the lack of control we still have over our passenger services. You look at Sheffield to Newcastle, cross-country trains, managed from London by DFT. You look at Chester, Warrington to Carlisle, Virgin Trains, controlled from London. How are we actually going
It's actually controlled from Birmingham, but that's nitpicking.
Well, okay. Sheffield to Liverpool, East Midlands trains. I could go
That's
on.
from London.
And that's not even getting onto freight. How are we going to take this to the next stage now? We have a fantastic plan, but we don't have control over the major passenger services connecting most of our northern cities still.
Thank you.
What are we going to do next, David?
David.
Okay, I'll have a go at that. So I think there are routes that are always going to be national routes that have to be an element of central control, doesn't have to be London control. I think the game changer, though, for us is the Strategic Transport Plan. That is now a statutory plan and statutory advice to government. So government and other parties will need to take that into account when they're developing proposals, letting franchises, etc. So we start to get more influence. We have a degree of influence on the Northern Transpennine franchises through a partnership with the Department for Transport. I think we can all see the frustration that we don't have more influence and didn't have more say, particularly over the last year. But we do have the ability now to put forward a business case for further devolution, and that's something that members will be looking at over the next few months. So I think it is step by step, but don't underestimate the power of having a strategic transport plan.
Yes. Rachel, do you want to add to that?
I simply echo the importance of a strategic transport plan is key, and it was a pleasure for me to be at that meeting last Thursday as well and see leaders across the North West region, irrespective of political allegiances, working together to deliver for the people of the area. And I think that's what we've got to keep hold on. We've got, and Judith said it in her opening comments, the importance, we hear it so often, good partnership working. In this instance, it's an absolute commitment of leaders to support one another that will gradually, I believe, bring that local decision-making more and more into the area.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the back of the room. Before I do, I think it's important to remember, one of our problems has got, we've never had a transport strategy in Great Britain. Never. It's always been left ad hoc. So there's never been any government that's ever said, this is our strategic transport plan. Also, if we're talking about elephants in the room, the real elephant that we have on Transport for the North is that our railways do not stop in one place. And they go off your patch. Yeah. For instance, we have the problem where you get to Chester and it falls off the end of the world. It goes into Wales. You know, and we're not allowed, I'm being serious, we're not allowed to even think about that. Now, that's absolutely silly. Because, of course, getting to Holyhead, you've got to go through Crewe and you've got to go through Chester to get there. But when it gets to the border, we're not allowed to interfere. And it's the same thing at the board. You get people talking from Cumbria and the train's coming up from London. On the continent, they run their railways different. And we have to probably look forward, and there's a lot of people don't like this, to go into the continental system where you change trains. Now, there's an elephant in the room. Gentleman at the back, please.
Yes, this is really a question, I think, particularly for Rachel, because she's a political figure in this debate. My name's Willie Cooper, and in the 90s, I was managing director of a bus company in this area. In a recent document I saw, it told me that First Great Western, which is regarded as a wonderful large rail company, carried 90 million passengers. That's fewer passengers than the bus services in the city where I started my career in Scotland, Edinburgh, carry in a year as well. So if we bring that to our particular neck of the woods, it means that it's probably likely that there are more bus passengers carried in Bradford and Kirklees, which is Huddersfield, together than on the entire Northern Rail network. The figure was quoted by David earlier on, that 4% of journeys to work are made by rail, 1.7% of total journeys are made by rail. The bus is for the people of Bradford, Huddersfield, East Lancs, Dewsbury, Barnsley, Doncaster, all these rather unfashionable towns in the north, much more important than rail. Bus has not been mentioned this morning other than in passing. I'd like your comments.
If I use the term multimodal, I include buses, and I actually said them in my address. Absolutely understand why you've raised the question, and it puts 2 points in my head that Pete will probably help me with one. The rise of bus services, particularly in cities, were very much on the demise of the railways. So I can understand that if there isn't, as capacity was reduced historically, and as connectivity with regard to bus services improved, there would be that interchange. If I look local to me, and if I look at the Crewe hub station, the number of people using that hub station has increased by 200,000 between, I think it's 14 and 16. And over 7.3 of those are using it as an interchange. So what I say to you is, actually, in delivering multimodal transport, it is replicating the continental model that we gave them, that there is the appropriate join-up and timetabling. And that's a lot easier than said than done. And what we've got today is the first starting point of that with the strategic transport plan, which, as Councillor Blake said earlier, the importance of local authorities' local transport plan meshing in is absolutely key. Because, of course, bus services in many areas, I know Warrington are here, and they have their own bus service company in Warrington. In Cheshire East, we rely on contribution to the private sector in a more rural area. But using that local investment and that local transport plan to get the join up with the overarching one is key. You might say you've seen a pig flying by as I've said this, and it's all political speak, but this is the starting point, And that's where we need to build on it. And there's another organisation that needs to be involved in this, and that's business through the local enterprise partnerships. Absolutely key that that investment is drawn down from government to enhance that multimodal and introduce and ensure delivery of your very valid point that where government, local government primes, business steps in and makes it happen. And I do hear your call, let us get on and do it. But that again is the importance of today. And as I said in my speech, it doesn't stop now. It's the ongoing business case as well.
Before I go to Barry, can I just say, you're absolutely right about the buses. In fact, at the last board meeting, it's the point we all made that in our April board meeting, buses will be top of the agenda. And you heard the Mayor of Sheffield talking about it on the stand earlier. It's a massive, massive, massive problem that we've all got to address. So you may not have heard a lot about it, but I promise you, it is pretty important to us, and we know how big it is. So do you just want to touch on that?
Yeah, just to add really, the focus of Transport for the North strategy and work is on the strategic networks, highways and rail networks, and that absolutely doesn't mean the other elements are important. It's just that buses, walking, cycling are done mainly locally. It's the integration between the two that we need to really push. And Pete's right that members did ask for additional emphasis to be put on that. And just a couple of other points. One is about the mode share. Rail. There are only very few rail lines that people can travel on, but actually where they do exist, the mode share can be considerably higher. Stations in West Yorkshire, in the north of Shipley, into Leeds, the mode share in the peak is 75% rail. And you look at the bus journey time, it's about 1 hour 15 minutes or something compared to 12 minutes on the train. So in certain circumstances, the mode share can be much higher. So it's very much horses for courses, really, I think.
Thank you. We're going to take a question here.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say, I represent Chris Brewis, Lincolnshire, and my nearest station I use is actually Kings Lynn, but I represent Lincolnshire, and I'm very enthusiastic, as you all know, about this entire project. But my question's coming. My nearest station being Lynn, I suspect now that someone has had to surrender their driving licence, the service from Lynn will be even better. Because a certain family from Sandringham use that service. But what I'm really coming up with, Maggie, thank you so much for mentioning Warrington. It was my suggestion 8 years ago that when the modernisation happened, the clearance was left for electrification if we ever needed it to increase capacity. And I'd like to talk with you about it later. But what I really want to do is share my story of going back from Chester. When I went to Chester, change at Stockport, Edgeley, and Sheffield Midland. Going from Sheffield Midland to Lincoln Central, the little overhead things on the train said that there would be a proper Saturday timetable from the 16th of February, and I have to say there was some enthusiasm on the train. But what I'm saying is, because of the timetabling problems, has any of the three of you got an idea of how we can recoup and recover the passengers who were so fed up that they went out and bought cars, and we may have lost for them immediate future? How can we now bring them back onto the network to use it again, which might free some time up on our roads?
Thank you. Who wants to leave with that one, other than putting the petrol prices up again, which would make us really popular? That'd go back on the trains, wouldn't it?
Pete, I feel like I'm talking too much, and you mustn't respond to that, but actually, the take-up with regard to taking your driving licence and funding a vehicle on the road I can't give you the stats on the hoof, but it has reduced where there is that infrastructure. So we all know that if you want to travel north-south, it's fine. But we know it's been very difficult, and still is, to travel west-east. So you won't have seen that change yet. And certainly with the connectivity that Crewe currently has, the number of people that choose to live in either a walking, cycling, or indeed driving distance of the station has increased dramatically as well.
Okay, I'll take another call from there.
Dan Larger, Confederation of British Industry. and please don't see my organisation as in any way leading this question, but would renationalisation of the wider network help or hinder the strategic transport plan, both in terms of finance and delivery?
Good question, that. I ain't got my crystal ball, Dan. Would you like to take this one?
I'll take it because I'm not affiliated to or paid by anybody political. So
no, not me.
Perhaps it makes it me for an easier answer than my colleagues here. Look, I mean, freight is not the passenger railway. So I think that some of the issues facing the passenger railway and some of the potential solutions out there are different. What I would say in response to that is that what hasn't been spoken about today is the Williams review of the structure of the UK rail industry, which is in its evidence-gathering phase now. It had a call for evidence, which I think is still technically open, although we tried to get ours in ahead of that, and we're expecting some early comments later in this month from Keith Williams. And there are colleagues in the room, I know, from DFT and Network Rail who are working very closely for us in terms of making the case for freight. Keith Williams may recommend that everything carries on just the same. There's, I suppose, a 1% chance he'll recommend renationalisation. Beyond that, there are different models he could recommend, and that could be everything from greater vertical integration, more regionalisation, greater powers for transport for the north, greater privatisation. The so-called Japanese model is something that seems to be finding favour. So when I look at what would a worldview be for my members, and you ask me about renationalisation, what am I comparing it to really matters. Am I comparing it to today? Am I comparing it to trying to get access over a Japanese-style privatised railway where all the control and power sits with the passenger train operators? Am I trying to gain access at some model that sits in between that? And I don't yet know. What I do know is that in any other model than what we've got today, there are some things that really matter to my members. One is, although we're here talking about the railways in the north, rail freight is a national business. The product that your exporters move is going out of the region to Scotland, to the south of England, to countries around the globe. The trains that arrive here that have come up from Felixstowe or from London need to be operating on a national basis. They need to be timetabled as such. They need to be facilitated as such. Whatever structure we have, that's really important. Secondly, we need to be making sure they're cost effective. If we increase the cost of rail freight just as increasing fares, we put traffic back on the road network. And thirdly, we have to have a structure of the railways that are incentivised to do the right thing for the outcomes that we want. In my case, that's more freight. In your case, this is more regional connectivity. If we privatise the East Coast Main Line, how do you get regional connectivity between the east and the west of the north of England? If we split it across the north of England, how do you get regional connectivity to the Midlands and Scotland? And these are the questions I think that need thinking about in the context of Williams.
I think it's also important to say there are two other reviews going on. One that we had given to the board about the timetable in debacle this year, which quite plainly points to non-connectivity between staff, people disenfranchised from talking to each other. And I think Network Rail's own new chief executive is looking into how people talk to each other, but also the most important thing is how people make a decision, because that's one of the railway's biggest problems. Next question. We got there.
Chris Pollock, Bootham Network Solutions. I'd like to echo Maggie's comment about it being a crime that the current plans for Transpennine upgrade did not include additional capacity and capability for freight.
Can we stop just there a second? Because I think it's a very excellent point, but I think we've got to put it in context, because it's too easy to have a chip at it without knowing all the story. So, David, let's have a bit about that, because it is a very good point, but it is more complicated than you think it is.
Not for my members, it's not.
No, but it is in the bigger, that's the problem. You see, if we look at your members in isolation, it's like the man at the back of his buses. We're trying to look at it as a bigger picture. And that's the point. Not everybody's going to win all of the time. So we've got to balance it. So I know what your members want, and I want more freight too, but we've got to look at what the decision was at that particular point to get this document out. Because I can tell you, this document was born very heavily. You know, this was not a natural birth.
So I think the position is we've been very clear as TfN. We want all the outputs from that Trans-Pennine route upgrade project, including the gauge cleared freight route. What we see is a commitment to a first phase at the moment, and I think our board members have been very clear about wanting to see future phases to the commitment to the outputs in full. But one of the big challenges over the next year for the industry is to come up with plans that will show how that first phase can be managed and delivered in a way that doesn't disrupt people's lives too much across the north, because people still want to get across the Pennines whilst that important work's going on.
So I'm going to go to Maggie now because you asked her the question. I just want to put into context that a certain large town in the northwest with a mayor had a very big objection to this because he wanted that, but the total scheme I think was 9.8 billion. David, I think the total scheme is 9.8 billion in total if we put it through.
Is this the investment?
The whole thing.
There's about 9 billion in the national plan for investment over the next control period.
The government have offered us 2.9. So what do? Do we walk away and say we'll not take the 2.9, but with the proviso that we can go back to Maggie's members when we've done a bit more work and then do the gauge clearance, or do we not take the money and do nothing? You see the problem? We ask for 9 million, we get 2.9 million. That's the reality of government. And I hope you were going to put your hand up. Sorry? Oh, sorry, we're going to hear from Maggie, but then we'll take the right man to answer this question, actually. He's sitting there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll defer to Jim in a moment, but
Yeah.
I mean, I think from my point of view is if you ask me today what are the incremental costs that you'd need to get a freight pass over the Trans-Pennine route, the work hasn't been done to conclude that. So we're saying that 2.9 billion definitely can't accommodate a freight pass on top of the passenger scheme, but there isn't yet the work to prove that. No, it hasn't. No, GRIP 3 work for the freight outputs is not yet complete.
Well, I think, okay, so I think we're talking about a slightly separate question. There's the Woodhead tunnel question. So Woodhead isn't the elephant in the room. Woodhead is potentially Woodhead is potentially a scheme that could come forward at some point. It isn't actually a scheme that has flowed from the transport plan at the moment. Whereas Trans-Pennine route upgrade is Trans-Pennine route upgrade is a worked up plan. We're arguing for the full outputs. It's not 9 billion to deliver the outputs in full. But Maggie's quite right. What? Well,
Jim, I think let's go to Jim. Jim, you know all about this, mate, because you nobbled me while I was having my egg sandwich.
Just for people to know, Jim Bamford, Head of Investment Planning for TfN Strategic Rail. What Maggie says is exactly 100% correct. The work has not been done yet to firmly establish what the costs would be. The initial work that I've seen, but I'm not allowed to share with you, is that the costs for providing for freight would, as an increment over and above electrification, would be very low, much lower than you might otherwise imagine, and that the electrification is required for reliability and journey time purposes as well. And one set of interventions between Huddersfield and Staley Bridge would produce you a triple benefit of reliability, journey time and freight clearance for a relatively modest cost. But Maggie, what Maggie says is exactly spot on, 100% right. The work has not yet been done to firmly establish the cost of that, but it is modest.
Right, but Jim, sorry, you've ducked the question. Now they've ducked the question, Jim. The point was that we only had 2.9 million, which is the cost of the scheme to get us moving.
First phase, yeah.
First phase. That's all we're talking about so far. So, yes, you're right, we haven't done that work because we've only looked at the first phase because we've only got 2.9 billion.
No, I don't think it's been
We-
done.
we
Remember
haven't-
that 2.9 billion will keep the Greater Manchester Police Force going for 5.5 years. So what I would like to see is an assessment that says how can we value manage the outputs for passenger and freight into the 2.9 billion. And we can't do that yet because the assessment work isn't complete. We haven't added up a project and got to 2.9 billion. We've got 2.9 billion. We've got some passenger outputs. We may or may not have some freight outputs. And for me, it just feels a bit disjointed at the moment that we haven't yet concluded how we could get everything into that money. And I'd like to see that work done. If at the end of that we have to decide that we won't ever do freight, and let's be clear, this is a decision not to ever do freight, because at the end of that phase, when £3 billion near enough has been spent and you've all been disrupted for years, re-disrupting it again to come back for freight, it won't happen and the market won't be there by then. So let's see, can we value manage those outputs into the money that we've got? I'm not trying to stop the right passenger outputs, far from it, or the scheme. I'd just like to see, could we try and find a way of accommodating everybody in what is a lot of money? Let's be no mistake.
I agree with you, and unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there because they need the room. So thank you very much indeed, and thanks to our guests on the stage. Thank you.